At 11:42, on the morning of May 1st, 1943, Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith cranked open the heavy, armored hatch of his ball turret and climbed up into a B-17 fuselage that was already being consumed by fire. He was 31 years old, a man who had lived a life of drifting and disappointment. He had 0 combat missions to his name. For 6 weeks, he had endured the humiliation of being told he was the worst airman in the entire squadron, a liability to anyone unfortunate enough to fly with him. But in this moment, high above the hostile coast of France, statistics and reputation ceased to matter. 15 Focke-Wulf, 190 fighters, the apex predators of the Luftwaffe, had located their formation over Brest. They were methodically, surgically, destroying every bomber they could isolate. This was the spring of 1943, a period historians now recognize as the bloodiest phase of the air war. The 8th Air Force was in the process of learning a brutal, visceral lesson over occupied Europe. The strategy of daylight precision bombing, unescorted by long-range fighters, was exacting a toll that bordered on the catastrophic. The average B-17 crew faced a statistical probability of survival that hovered around 50% for their 25-mission tour. In some disastrous months, bomb groups were losing that many men and machines in a span of 30 days. The submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire had earned a grim nickname among the terrified American air crews who had to fly through the wall of steel sent up by German gunners. They called it Flak City. It was a place where bombers went to die. On this particular mission, the stakes were lethally high. 78 flying fortresses had thundered off the runways of England that morning, their engines shaking the damp British soil. Only 29 would succeed in dropping their bombs on the primary target. 7 of those majestic aircraft would never come home, reduced to smoking wreckage scattered across the French countryside. Before the sun set that evening, 75 young Americans would be listed on the casualty rolls as killed or missing in action. Staff Sergeant Smith was supposed to be one of those grim statistics. Everyone at Thurley Airfield, from the base commander to the mechanics, expected it. It wasn't just because the mission was dangerous. Every mission over the Reich was a dance with death. They expected it because Maynard Smith was, by universal agreement, the most useless, unmotivated, and difficult soldier in the 306th Bomb Group. The nickname came first, sticking to him like a badge of dishonor, Snuffy. It was a reference to a popular comic strip character, a lazy, scheming hillbilly who avoided work at all costs. For Smith, it fit perfectly. He was 31 years old, in an army of fresh-faced 20-year-olds. He resented taking orders from officers who were a decade younger than himself, men he viewed as children playing at war. He had joined the Army Air Forces for one reason, and one reason only. A judge in Michigan had given him a stark ultimatum. He could go to jail for unpaid child support, or he could enter military service. Smith chose the uniform, viewing it as the lesser of two evils, but he never chose to be a soldier in spirit. At Thurley, he became legendary for all the wrong reasons. He was the antithesis of the disciplined military man. He slept through critical briefings. He argued incessantly with officers, challenging their logic and authority. He lectured other airmen on philosophy, politics, and the injustices of the world until they simply walked away to avoid him. His personnel file grew thick with disciplinary actions, a testament to his inability to conform. The men of the 423rd Bombardment Squadron eventually adopted a simple, unwritten policy regarding Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith. Nobody wanted to fly with him. He was a pariah. For 6 weeks, Smith sat on the ground, grounded by his own reputation, while other crews flew mission after mission, facing death while he peeled potatoes or shirked duties. Pilots specifically requested that he not be assigned to their aircraft, fearing that in a crisis, Smith would freeze or fail. When a crew needed a replacement ball turret gunner, a position with a notoriously short life expectancy, they asked for anyone else. Anyone but Snuffy. To understand why this rejection was so absolute, one must understand the ball turret. It was widely considered the most claustrophobic, terrifying position on the B-17 Flying Fortress. It was a plexiglass and steel sphere, hanging beneath the belly of the fuselage, isolated from the rest of the crew. It was barely large enough for a small man to curl into a fetal position, his knees pressed against his chest, his hands gripping the controls. He was surrounded by two .50 caliber machine guns and a computing gun sight Between the gunner and 30,000 feet of empty air, there was nothing but a few inches of aluminum, glass, and the cold wind. If the electrical system failed, the turret could get stuck, trapping the gunner inside, facing down toward the earth, helpless. Smith was short, standing only 5 feet 4 inches. Physically, he was the perfect build for the cramped position. In every other way, temperament, discipline, camaraderie, he was considered a liability. The men who had to trust their lives to their crewmates did not trust Maynard Smith. On the morning of May 1st, however, the brutal mathematics of war forced their hand. A crew was short 1 gunner. There were no other replacements available on the base. For the first time in 6 weeks, Staff Sergeant Smith climbed into a B-17. The aircraft was piloted by Captain Lewis Johnson, a seasoned veteran completing his 25th and final mission. The significance of this cannot be overstated. After today, Johnson was going home. He had survived the most dangerous assignment in the American military. One more mission, one more flight through the gauntlet, still stood between him and the safety of the United States. He needed a crew that was sharp, cohesive, and ready. Instead, he got Snuffy Smith. Smith had no idea what combat actually looked like. He had trained on fixed targets in peaceful skies. He had memorized procedures in classrooms. But he had never seen a German fighter diving at him at 400 miles per hour with cannons blazing. He had never watched a B-17 explode in midair, turning into a cloud of debris and fire. He had never smelled the distinct, sickly scent of burning flesh at 25,000 feet. He was about to learn all of it, every horrific detail, in a single afternoon. If you want to see how Smith's first mission turned out and understand the paradox of this complex man, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories with more viewers who appreciate history. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Smith. The mission began well enough, but disaster struck on the return flight. The formation crossed the French coast, but the navigator made a fatal, tragic error. In the haze and confusion, he mistook the Brittany Peninsula for the southern coast of England. It was a mistake born of exhaustion and difficult visibility. But the consequences were immediate. Captain Johnson began descending through the clouds, believing they were almost home, preparing for a safe landing. They broke through the cloud cover at 2,000 feet, vulnerable and low. Directly below them, instead of the green fields of England, was the heavily fortified city of Brest, a German stronghold bristling with anti-aircraft batteries. The reaction from the ground was instantaneous. The anti-aircraft guns opened fire immediately, filling the sky with black puffs of flak. Then the fighters came. Focke-Wulf, 190 seconds, 15 to 20 of them, swarming like angry hornets, protecting their nest. The B-17 shuddered violently as cannon shells ripped through the fuselage. The sound was deafening. The roar of engines, the tearing of metal, the explosion of shells. The left-wing fuel tank ruptured. Highly flammable aviation gasoline poured into the radio compartment and ignited instantly. The oxygen system, vital for life at high altitude, but an explosive hazard when compromised, detonated. In that chaotic moment, Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith, the airman nobody wanted, found himself staring at a choice that would define the rest of his life. The situation inside the fuselage was apocalyptic. 3 crewmen were already gone. The radio operator, Technical Sergeant Henry Bean, and the 2 waist gunners, Staff Sergeants Robert Folliard and Joseph Bukacek, had made their calculation. They looked at the fire, they felt the heat, and they jumped from the burning aircraft. They preferred the uncertainty of a parachute over the certainty of burning to death. They had gone out the door, into the sky, over occupied France. German soldiers watched them descend. None of the 3 would survive the day. Smith did not know their fate. He stood alone in the waist section. The tail gunner was wounded and trapped in the rear. The waist was an inferno. Every survival instinct, every biological imperative screamed at him to follow the others out the door. Escape was right there. The parachute was his ticket to life. Smith looked at the flames climbing the walls. He looked at the emergency exit. Then, defying all logic and his own history of self-preservation, he started moving toward the fire. To understand the magnitude of this decision, one must visualize the interior of a B-17 waist section. It measured roughly 14 feet long and 6 feet wide. In normal conditions, it was cramped, but functional. 2 waist gunners stood at open windows on either side, manning. 50 caliber machine guns on flexible mounts. The radio compartment sat forward. The tail section extended aft. A narrow crawlway connected the waist to the ball turret below, but these were not normal conditions. Aviation gasoline burns at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. When the fuel tank ruptured above the radio compartment, the liquid sprayed across equipment, ammunition boxes, and the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft. The fire spread in seconds, fueled by the rushing wind coming through the open gun ports. Flames climbed the walls, consuming everything in their path. Smoke filled the confined space with toxic fumes, choking the remaining air. The temperature inside the waist section began rising toward levels that would melt human skin on contact. Smith had no firefighting equipment worthy of the name. The B-17 carried small extinguishers, but they were designed for minor electrical fires, not a raging inferno fed by aviation fuel. The standard procedure for an uncontrollable aircraft fire was simple and brutal. Get out. Every airman knew the mathematics of survival. A burning bomber at 2,000 feet gave a crew perhaps 90 seconds to evacuate before structural failure tore the wings off. Parachutes worked. Staying aboard a burning aircraft was suicide. Yet, Smith stayed. He knew that Sergeant Roy Gibson, the tail gunner, had taken shrapnel wounds during the initial fighter attack. Gibson was trapped in the tail section, cut off by the wall of fire. If the fire reached the tail, Gibson would burn alive. If the fire reached the main oxygen tanks, the entire aircraft would explode in a massive fireball. If the fire weakened the fuselage structure, the B-17 would break apart in flight, killing everyone instantly. Smith grabbed the first thing he could find, a heavy wool blanket. He beat at the flames with a desperate fury, trying to smother the heart of the fire. But the heat was too intense. The blanket caught fire in his hands, and he had to throw it away before it burned him. He found a piece of canvas and tried again. Same result. The gasoline-fed fire was too hot, too fast, spreading across too wide an area. It was a living, breathing monster that wanted to consume the plane. Then, a new danger emerged. The ammunition began cooking off. Boxes of 50 caliber rounds were stacked along the waist section walls. As the temperature rose, the brass casings expanded. The gunpowder inside reached its ignition point. Bullets began firing in random directions, ricocheting off the interior surfaces of the aircraft with terrifying pings and zips. Smith was now fighting a fire while live ammunition exploded around him, turning the fuselage into a metal blender. He made a decision that violated every safety protocol in the Army Air Force's manual, a decision born of pure desperation. The 50 caliber rounds were feeding the chaos. Every box that cooked off created new shrapnel, new fires, new dangers. Smith began picking up the ammunition boxes with his bare hands. The metal was searing hot, hot enough to burn flesh instantly. He didn't hesitate. He carried them to the waist gun, windows, and threw them out of the aircraft. Box after box, he hauled the explosives to the opening and hurled them into the slipstream. His hands blistered. The skin cracked and bled. The pain must have been excruciating, but adrenaline and a singular focus kept him moving. He kept working. Between ammunition runs, he returned to fighting the fire. He had discovered that the only liquid available was the relief tube. The crew urinated into a funnel connected to a tube that vented outside the aircraft. Smith disconnected the tube and used the contents to douse the flames. It was a pathetic amount of liquid against a raging fire, but he used it anyway. When that ran out, he found a fire extinguisher and emptied it. When that ran out, he urinated directly on the burning surfaces. He was improvising, using every resource, no matter how crude, to buy the plane one more minute of existence. But the Focke-Wulfs had not finished. The German fighter pilots could see the smoke trailing from the crippled bomber. To them, a damaged aircraft was blood in the water. They knew it was vulnerable. They came in for repeated attack runs, their cannons flashing. Cannon shells punched through the aluminum skin, adding new holes to a fuselage already perforated by flak and fire. Each pass forced Smith to abandon his firefighting duties and man the waist guns. He had never fired at an enemy aircraft in his life. His training had involved stationary targets and classroom instruction. Now, he was swinging a heavy 50 caliber machine gun at fighters diving past at over 300 miles per hour. He squeezed the trigger in short bursts, the recoil shaking his battered body, trying to fill the air with enough lead to discourage another attack. He had to be the firefighter and the defender simultaneously. He would fire a burst, watch the fighter peel away, and then rush back to the flames. Then back to the guns, then back to the fire. It was a macabre dance of survival. For 90 minutes, an eternity in combat, Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith performed a one-man firefighting and defensive operation that should have been physically impossible. The man who had spent 6 weeks being told he was worthless was now the only thing standing between 6 surviving crewmen and certain death. Up in the cockpit, Captain Johnson fought a physical battle of his own to keep the aircraft airborne. The controls were damaged and sluggish. Several vital cables had been severed by cannon fire. The aircraft wanted to dive, to roll, to do anything except fly straight and level. Johnson wrestled with the yoke, his muscles burning, coaxing every possible mile out of a machine that was dying around him. They needed to reach England. They needed to find an airfield. They needed to land before the fuselage burned through completely and the tail fell off. Behind him, in the smoke and flame and chaos of the waist section, Smith had finally gained the upper hand. The fire was dying. The ammunition was gone. The tail gunner was still alive. But the English coast was still miles away, and the B-17 was held together by little more than faith and aluminum fragments. The English Channel stretched below them like a gray, infinite metal plate. Cold. Flat. Unforgiving. A B-17 that went down in those waters gave its crew approximately 4 minutes before hypothermia set in. Rescue was possible, but unlikely. The Channel had already swallowed hundreds of American airmen in the first months of 1943. Captain Johnson scanned the instrument panel. The fuel gauges were dropping alarmingly. The ruptured tank had dumped most of their reserve over France. What remained was barely enough to reach the English coast. Maybe, if the headwinds stayed light, if the remaining engines held together, if the fire-weakened fuselage did not tear itself apart from the aerodynamic stresses of flight. Every vibration felt like a potential structural failure. Behind him, Smith had won his battle. The flames were out. Charred metal and melted wiring covered the waist section floor. The smell of burned rubber, ozone, and aviation fuel saturated every surface. But the fire was dead. Killed by 90 minutes of desperate improvisation by a man who had never been trained for anything like this. Smith crawled aft to check on the tail gunner. Sergeant Roy Gibson was conscious but badly wounded. Shrapnel had torn through his legs and torso during the initial fighter attack. He had been trapped in the tail section throughout the fire, unable to move forward, unable to help, able only to wait and hope that the flames would not reach him. Smith administered first aid with the aircraft's emergency kit. He bandaged the wounds as best he could, his own hands raw and bleeding. He made Gibson as comfortable as possible in the cramped tail compartment. Then he returned to the waist section and manned the guns again, watching the gray horizon for any German fighters that might have followed them over the channel. None came. The Focke-Wulfs had turned back at the French coast, unwilling to venture over open water where British Spitfires patrolled. The crippled B-17 limped toward England alone, a broken bird trailing smoke from a dozen holes in its aluminum skin. Finally, through the haze, the coast of Cornwall appeared. It was the most beautiful sight they had ever seen. Johnson began looking for any flat surface long enough to land a 4-engine bomber. The normal procedure would be to return to Thurley, their home base in Bedfordshire. That was impossible. The aircraft would never survive another 200 miles of flight. They needed to land immediately. RAF Predanak sat on the southwestern tip of England. It was a grass airfield, originally built for coastal defense fighters, not heavy bombers. The runway was short by B-17 standards. The facilities were minimal, but it was flat, and it was close, and it was their only option. Johnson lined up his approach, his heart pounding. The landing gear extended. 3 green lights confirmed the wheels were down and locked. He reduced power and let the battered aircraft sink toward the grass strip. The touchdown was smooth. Johnson had flown 25 missions and survived everything the Luftwaffe could throw at him. He knew how to land a damaged bomber. The wheels touched, the aircraft rolled, and for a moment, it seemed like the ordeal was finally over. Then physics took over. The fuselage cracked. The fire had done more damage than anyone realized. The aluminum skin had lost its structural integrity in the area around the radio compartment. The stress of landing, the weight of the aircraft settling onto its wheels, was more than the weakened metal could bear. With a groan of tearing metal, the B-17 broke in half just behind the wing root. The nose section slid forward, the tail section ground to a halt separately, Rescue crews who had been waiting at the edge of the runway sprinted toward the wreckage, sirens wailing, expecting to find bodies. What they found, instead, defied belief. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was climbing out of the shattered fuselage, his hands wrapped in bloody bandages, his flight suit covered in soot and burns, helping a wounded tail gunner to safety. He looked like a man who had walked through hell and emerged out the other side. Ground crews counted the holes later. 3,500 individual penetrations from bullets, cannon shells, and shrapnel fragments. The aircraft had absorbed more damage than any B-17 they had ever seen return to base. The fact that it had remained airborne long enough to reach England defied every engineering calculation. It was a miracle of aerodynamics and willpower. Captain Johnson wrote his mission report that evening. His assessment of Staff Sergeant Smith was unequivocal and glowing. The ball turret gunner's actions were solely responsible for the safe return of the aircraft and the lives of everyone aboard. Without Smith, the plane would have burned and crashed in France. Johnson recommended Smith for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation went up the chain of command, gathering endorsements at every level. Within days, a correspondent from Stars and Stripes newspaper arrived at Thurley to interview the unlikely hero. His name was Andy Rooney. He was 23 years old, a young journalist who would later become one of the most famous broadcasters in American television history on Time's 60 Minutes, **. Rooney found Smith in the barracks. The sergeant with the burned hands and the disciplinary record and the reputation as the worst airman in the squadron, Rooney listened to the story. He took notes. He asked questions. Then, he wrote an article that would make Maynard Smith famous across 2 continents. The story hit the newspapers within a week. The Army Air Forces had been desperately looking for heroes. The bombing campaign over Europe was costing thousands of young American lives. Morale on the home front needed boosting, and here was a story that seemed almost too perfect. The misfit who became a hero. The troublemaker who saved his crew. The man nobody wanted, who turned out to be exactly what they needed. It was a classic American underdog story. Smith was about to discover that fame could be as complicated as combat. The story had everything a wartime propaganda office could want. An underdog, a burning aircraft, a one-man rescue operation against impossible odds. Within days of publication, Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was the most famous enlisted airman in the European theater of operations. The Army Air Force's public relations machine activated immediately. Photographers arrived at Thurley to capture images of the hero. Smith posed beside B-17 seconds. He demonstrated the ball turret for cameras. He stood with officers who had barely spoken to him a week earlier. The pictures went out to newspapers across the United States. Mothers in Michigan and Ohio and California saw the small man with the burned hands and felt hope that their own sons might survive the war. Radio programs picked up the story. Commentators described the 90-minute battle against foreign fighters with breathless excitement. They emphasized the details that made Smith memorable. The man nobody wanted. The first combat mission. The aircraft that broke in half on landing. Each retelling added new layers of drama to an event that needed no embellishment. Smith received mail. Thousands of letters from strangers poured in. Women proposed marriage. Children asked for autographs. Veterans of the First World War wrote to congratulate him. The postal clerks at Thurley had never processed so much correspondence for a single enlisted man. The men of the 423rd Bombardment Squadron watched this transformation with complicated emotions. They had spent 6 weeks avoiding Maynard Smith. They had complained about his attitude, his laziness, his inability to function as part of a team. Now that same man was being celebrated as a national hero. The newspapers called him brave. The radio called him exceptional. The Army Air Forces called him exactly the kind of soldier America needed. The squadron knew a different truth. Smith had been genuinely heroic on May 1st. No one disputed that. His actions aboard the burning B-17 had saved lives and demonstrated courage under circumstances that would have broken most men. But heroism in combat did not change the fundamental nature of the man who performed it. Smith remained difficult. He still argued with officers.
Wait your turn.
He still lectured other airmen on subjects they had no interest in discussing. He still believed that his age and intelligence entitled him to special treatment. The only difference now was that he had a Medal of Honor recommendation supporting his sense of superiority. The attention went to his head almost immediately. Smith began signing autographs with a new signature. Sergeant Maynard Smith,
And then the whole
CMH,
refinery
the Congressional
went up.
Medal of Honor,
The
he had not
fireball,
yet received.
it must have been
He told and
this
retold the
big.
story of May 1st to anyone who would listen, and the story grew larger with each telling. Details shifted, emphasis changed. The 90 minutes of desperate firefighting became an epic narrative in which Smith played an increasingly central role. Other crewmen noticed the exaggerations, small inconsistencies at first, then larger ones. Smith began describing actions he had not performed, decisions he had not made, conversations he had not had. The core of the story remained true. He had fought the fire. He had saved the crew. But the decorations around that core became increasingly fictional. This was the paradox of Maynard Smith, a genuine hero who could not stop embellishing his genuine heroism. A man who had earned respect through extraordinary actions, but squandered that respect through ordinary vanity. The squadron tolerated him because they had no choice. He was about to receive the highest military decoration the United States could bestow. Criticizing him publicly would reflect poorly on the entire unit. The Medal of Honor recommendation moved through official channels. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, reviewed the paperwork personally. The evidence was overwhelming. Captain Johnson's report, the witness statements, the physical condition of the aircraft. Every document confirmed that Staff Sergeant Smith had performed acts of valor far beyond what could reasonably be expected of any soldier. Eaker approved the recommendation and forwarded it to Washington. The War Department reviewed the case and concurred. The medal was authorized. A ceremony would be scheduled. For the first time in the history of American military aviation, an enlisted airman would receive the Medal of Honor in the European theater. The date was set for July. Secretary of War Henry Stimson would travel to England personally to present the decoration. It would be the largest public ceremony the 8th Air Force had ever conducted. Photographers would document every moment. Newsreel cameras would capture the event for theaters across America. The story of Snuffy Smith would reach its triumphant conclusion in front of the entire world. The Army began planning with meticulous detail. They arranged for a formation of B-17 seconds to fly overhead during the presentation. They constructed a ceremonial platform. They notified the press corps. They coordinated every detail to ensure that the event would generate maximum positive coverage for the war effort. They did not coordinate with Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith. No one told him the date of his own Medal of Honor ceremony. No one confirmed that he understood the schedule. The public relations officers assumed someone else had handled the notification. The squadron officers assumed the same. In the confusion of planning a major military event, the guest of honor fell through the cracks. July 15th arrived. Secretary Stimson stood at the podium. The B-17 seconds circled overhead. The cameras rolled. The assembled dignitaries waited. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was nowhere to be found. A panic set in. A search party fanned out across Thurley Airfield. Officers checked the barracks. They checked the officers' club. They checked every building where an airman might reasonably spend a summer morning. Secretary of War Stimson waited at the ceremonial platform with the patience of a man accustomed to military delays, but the embarrassment was growing. The B-17 seconds continued circling overhead, burning fuel that the 8th Air Force could not afford to waste. Someone finally thought to check the mess hall. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was in the kitchen. He was not eating breakfast. He was scraping leftover food from metal trays into garbage bins. The hero of May 1st, the man about to receive the highest military decoration his country could bestow, had been assigned to Kitchen Police Duty KP as punishment for his latest disciplinary infraction. The officer who found him did not record what was said, but the moment was too absurd for official documentation. Smith was rushed from the kitchen to the ceremony, still wearing his work uniform, grease stains visible on his sleeves. He barely had time to clean his hands before Secretary Stimson placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. The newsreel cameras captured everything. The photographs went out to newspapers across America. The story that emerged was carefully edited. The Army emphasized the heroism, the ceremony, the historic significance of the first enlisted Medal of Honor in Europe. They did not mention that the recipient had been washing dishes when they found him. But the men at Thurley knew. The story spread through the 8th Air Force within hours. Snuffy Smith, the hero who could not stay out of trouble long enough to attend his own medal ceremony. The irony was too perfect to remain secret. For years afterward, veterans would tell the story as proof that courage and character were not the same thing. Smith flew 4 more combat missions after receiving the Medal of Honor. Each time he climbed into the ball turret of a B-17 and watched the ground fall away beneath him, each time he scanned the skies for German fighters and waited for the flak to start bursting around the formation, he had proven himself capable of extraordinary heroism. But heroism did not make the fear disappear. The fifth mission was his last. The psychological toll of combat had accumulated beyond what his mind could process. Smith began exhibiting symptoms that the Army Air Force's medical officers recognized but did not fully understand. Nightmares, anxiety, inability to concentrate. The modern term is post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. In 1943, they called it operational exhaustion. The doctors grounded him. No more combat flying. The Medal of Honor recipient who had saved 6 lives over Brest would spend the rest of his war behind a desk, processing paperwork far from the sound of engines and gunfire. Smith did not handle the transition well. He had become accustomed to the attention that came with his medal. Journalists still wanted interviews. Photographers still wanted pictures. But the daily reality of his life was now clerical work in an administrative office, surrounded by men who had heard all his stories and grown tired of hearing them again. His disciplinary problems continued. Perhaps they worsened. The official records show a pattern of conflicts with superior officers, failures to complete assigned duties, and a general inability to function within the military structure. The same characteristics that had made him an outcast before May first remained unchanged after his moment of glory. By December of 1944, the Army had run out of patience. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith, holder of the Medal of Honor, was reduced in rank to private. The demotion was unprecedented. No Medal of Honor recipient had ever been stripped of rank while still in service. The Army did not publicize the action. The contrast between the hero of the newspapers and the problem soldier of the personnel files was too damaging to acknowledge publicly. Smith was permanently grounded. His flying days were over. His usefulness to the war effort had been reduced to whatever administrative tasks he could complete, without causing additional problems. In February of 1945, the Army sent him home. The war in Europe had 4 months left to run. The 8th Air Force would continue bombing Germany until the final surrender. Thousands of young Americans would die in B-17 seconds over targets that Smith would never see. He returned to Michigan. His hometown of Cairo organized a parade. The citizens who remembered the spoiled troublemaker now celebrated the returning hero. They lined the streets and cheered. They waved flags. They welcomed back a man who had done something extraordinary on a single afternoon in May of 1943. None of them knew about the demotion. None of them knew about the disciplinary record. They knew only what the newspapers had told them. A local boy had earned the Medal of Honor. Smith stood in the back of an open car and waved to the crowds. For one afternoon, he was everything the Army had wanted him to be. A symbol, an inspiration. A reason to believe that ordinary Americans could become heroes when their country needed them most. The parade ended, the crowds dispersed, and Maynard Smith began the long process of figuring out what came next. The war ended in May of 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The 8th Air Force had dropped over 600,000 tons of bombs on occupied Europe. More than 26,000 American airmen had died in the campaign. Another 28,000 had been captured or listed as missing. The strategic bombing offensive had been the most costly air operation in military history. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith had contributed 90 minutes to that effort. One mission, one burning aircraft. One afternoon of extraordinary courage, followed by months of ordinary failure. His discharge papers arrived on the 26th of May, 1945. He was 34 years old, a former private with a Medal of Honor, and no clear idea of what civilian life would look like. The transition proved difficult. Smith had never been good at holding jobs before the war. His personality had not changed during his time in uniform. He remained argumentative, opinionated, and convinced of his own superiority. These characteristics had made him unpopular in the Army. They made him equally unpopular in the civilian workforce. He cycled through employment, tax work, clerical positions. Nothing lasted. Smith would start a job, clash with supervisors, and either quit or be fired. The Medal of Honor opened some doors, but his behavior closed them again. Employers who hired a war hero discovered they had also hired a difficult employee. His personal life followed similar patterns. Smith married again after the war. The marriage failed. He married a third time. That marriage also failed. The pattern repeated itself. Women were attracted to the heroic story. They were less attracted to the complicated man behind it. Child support obligations accumulated, legal troubles mounted. By the early 1950s, Maynard Smith had become what he had always been before May 1st, 1943, a man who could not quite make his life work. He clung to his medal because he had nothing else. In 1979, Smith gave his final major interview. A military magazine called Times Sergeant's Times published his account of the mission. The story had reached its most elaborate form. Smith described actions he could not have performed, conversations he could not have had, a version of events that bore only partial resemblance to the documented record. Nobody corrected him. He was 68 years old. The Medal of Honor still hung from his ribbon. Whatever distortions had accumulated over 36 years, the core truth remained. He had been a hero once. That would have to be enough. The Medal of Honor has been awarded approximately 3,500 times in American military history. Each recipient represents an act of valor so extraordinary that it stands apart from the millions of individual moments of courage that occur in every war. The standard is deliberately extreme. The decoration is reserved for those who risk their lives above and beyond any reasonable expectation of duty. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith met that standard on May 1st, 1943. Whatever complications followed, whatever failures accumulated, the 90 minutes over Brest satisfied the most rigorous criteria the American military possessed. He had been one man against fire and fighters and the reasonable certainty of death. He had chosen to stay when leaving was easier. He had saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. The historical record places Smith in a specific context. He was the first enlisted airman to receive the Medal of Honor in the European theater. Only 2 others would join him before the war ended. Technical Sergeant Forrest Vossler earned his medal in December of 1943 for similar actions aboard a burning B-17 over Bremen. Staff Sergeant Archibald Matthews received his posthumously for staying at the controls of a crippled bomber long enough for his crew to bail out. 3 enlisted men, 3 Medals of Honor, thousands of other airmen who performed acts of courage that went unrecognized. The mathematics of recognition were brutal. The 8th Air Force flew hundreds of thousands of individual combat sorties. Each sortie placed 10 men in danger. Each mission produced countless moments of bravery, sacrifice, and determination. The vast majority of these moments were never recorded. Men died heroically in aircraft that simply disappeared. Crews fought fires and wounds and mechanical failures over hostile territory, and no one survived to document what they had done. Smith was lucky. His aircraft made it back. His pilot wrote a report. A journalist happened to be looking for stories. The machinery of recognition activated around him because the circumstances aligned. Other men performed equivalent acts and received nothing. The randomness of survival determined whose heroism would be remembered. This is not to diminish what Smith accomplished. The Medal of Honor was earned, not given. But the broader truth of aerial combat in 1943 was that heroism was common and recognition was rare. The men who flew B-17 seconds into German airspace accepted the probability of death every time they climbed aboard. They did not expect medals. They expected only to do their duty and, if fortune favored them, to survive. Smith lived 4 more decades after his discharge. He moved to Florida in his later years, settling in the Tampa Bay area where the warm climate suited his aging body. The Medal of Honor opened occasional doors. He attended ceremonies. He spoke at veterans' events. He remained until the end, a man defined by 90 minutes that had occurred when he was 31 years old. His health declined gradually. The accumulated stresses of age and hard living took their toll. The burned hands that had thrown ammunition boxes through the waste gun windows developed arthritis. The lungs that had inhaled smoke and fumes over Brest grew weaker. The body that had performed impossible physical feats in 1943 became an ordinary elderly frame in 1984. Maynard Harrison Smith died on May 11th, 1984, in St. Petersburg, Florida. He was 72 years old. Heart failure was listed as the cause. He had outlived most of the men who had flown with him, and most of the men who had refused to fly with him. The Army honored his passing despite the complicated history. Medal of Honor recipients are entitled to burial at Arlington National Cemetery, regardless of their subsequent service record. The demotion did not matter. The disciplinary file did not matter. The only thing that mattered was the blue ribbon with the white stars and the gold medal that hung from it. Smith was laid to rest among the rows of white headstones that mark the final resting place of American military dead. Generals lie near privates. Heroes lie near ordinary soldiers. The democracy of death erases the distinctions that seem so important in life. His grave marker identifies him simply: name, rank, dates of service, Medal of Honor. The stone says nothing about kitchen police duty, or disciplinary problems, or embellished interviews. It says nothing about the marriages that failed, or the jobs that did not last. It records only the essential fact: this man served. This man was honored. This man rests here. The question that remains is how to remember him. The easy narrative wants heroes to be heroic in all things. It wants courage in combat to reflect courage in character. It wants the man who saves lives to be worthy of admiration in every aspect of his existence. Maynard Smith refused to fit that narrative. He was difficult before the war, during the war, and after the war. He was heroic for 90 minutes and problematic for 72 years. He earned the nation's highest honor and the nation's frustration in equal measure. Perhaps that complexity is the most honest legacy he could leave. The 306th Bomb Group completed 342 combat missions before the war ended. They dropped over 22,000 tons of bombs on targets across occupied Europe. 171 of their aircraft were lost in action. The men who flew from Thurley paid a price measured in thousands of individual lives, each one representing a family that received a telegram beginning with words no parent or wife ever wanted to read. The group earned a reputation as one of the most experienced units in the 8th Air Force. They were first over Germany in January of 1943. They flew the dangerous early missions when fighter escort was limited and losses were catastrophic. They adapted, survived, and continued flying until there was nothing left to bomb. Maynard Smith's story became part of that larger history. The 306th Bomb Group Association preserved the records of every mission, every crew, every aircraft that flew from the grass runways of Thurley. Smith appears in those records exactly as he was. A difficult man who did an extraordinary thing. A hero who could not escape his own limitations. The National Museum of the Mighty 8th Air Force stands in Pooler, Georgia, outside Savannah. The museum preserves the history of the air campaign over Europe through artifacts, documents, and personal testimonies. Visitors can walk through a restored B-17 and understand the cramped spaces where young men fought and died. They can read the names of the fallen on memorial walls. They can learn about men like Smith who earned recognition, and men who earned none. The ball turret hangs beneath the aircraft like a glass and steel egg. Museum guides explain how a small man would curl into the fetal position inside that sphere, rotating with the turret as he tracked enemy fighters through his gun sight. They describe the isolation of the position, the vulnerability, the absolute dependence on the crew above to crank the turret back into position if electrical power failed. Smith's turret lost power over Brest. He cranked himself out manually and climbed into a burning fuselage. That detail alone captures something essential about aerial combat in 1943. Technology failed constantly. Survival depended on human improvisation. The men who lived were often the men who refused to accept that the situation was hopeless. The airfield at Thurley still exists, though it has changed. The runways have been converted to other uses. The buildings where Smith slept and ate and caused disciplinary problems have been demolished or repurposed. But the land remembers. Markers identify the site as a former American bomber base. Visitors from the United States occasionally make pilgrimages to stand where their fathers and grandfathers once stood. The English countryside absorbed enormous quantities of American blood during the Second World War. Young men from Michigan and Texas and California flew over those green fields on their way to Germany. Many never returned. The ones who did carried memories that would last the rest of their lives. Thurley was one of dozens of such bases scattered across eastern England. Each one has its own history of courage and loss. Smith's Medal of Honor remains part of the historical record. The citation describes his actions in official language stripped of emotion. Fighting fires, administering first aid, manning guns, throwing burning ammunition overboard. The bureaucratic prose cannot capture what it felt like to stand in a burning aircraft with German fighters attacking and 3 crewmen already gone. It can only document that these things happened. The man himself defies simple categorization. He was not a natural hero. He was not even a competent soldier, by most measures. But when the moment arrived that demanded everything a human being could give, Maynard Smith gave it. The 90 minutes over Brest revealed a capacity for courage that surprised everyone, including perhaps Smith himself. That is the lesson his story offers. Heroism does not require perfection. It does not require likability. It requires only the willingness to act when action is needed, regardless of fear, regardless of odds, regardless of what came before, or what might come after. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was a flawed man who did a perfect thing. That should be enough for any legacy. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about gunners who saved lives with burned hands and bare fists. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Maynard Smith does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.